We're going to transition to our faces. Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to some Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about Pathfinder 2e, Taking20's take on it. We're like the latest to the game on this response to this thing. But
Yeah, this was 2 months ago,
yeah,
basically.
it was 2 months ago, and everybody else in that space already had their say. So we're going to come in to mop up, I guess. But before we do that, buddy, I want you to focus on what it is we do on this podcast.
On this podcast, we talk about games. We have not done a tabletop episode in a long time, and this proved to be a very good one. To kind of come back to, I guess. So to summarize for everyone who hasn't necessarily watched the video, but if you're listening to the podcast and you do want to watch the video, probably a couple other related ones will be down in the description. The title of the video is I'm quitting Pathfinder 2e for this reason, or here's why, or something like that, some clickbaity kind of title. And the guy Taking20, who is a kind of a YouTuber, 250,000 subs, who talks about like tabletop gaming all the time, talks about how he and his group have had trouble with 2e as they have progressed through the levels, right? As their characters have become more and more powerful, as they become more and more optimized, they feel as though there is an illusion of choice in their decision makings inside of combat. Which isn't to say that like when you're building a character, you have plenty of choices. You have lots of choices. You can take this feat or that feat. Those choices aren't what he's talking about. What he's talking about is in combat, what is the thing I'm going to do? And the thing I'm going to do in most scenarios is going to be
The same.
yeah, it's going to be the same, right? The scenario that he brings up in most detail is the shoot. It's like hunter's prey, hunter's shot, strike for a ranger, right? Who uses action 1 to set a mark, action 2 to shoot a guy, to shoot his mark, action 3 to just make a basic auto
Yeah,
on
and it would
on
have.
that mark,
Yeah,
or basic strike. I say a strike is sort of like an auto in an MMORPG, I guess.
yeah, yeah. And so this of course caused a firestorm of sorts on the RPG sphere, which is not very large. It's
Yeah.
it's funny because like he is by far the largest channel at like 250K, which isn't nothing, but like I'm watching responses from like people that are like you know sub 10K subscribers. So maybe he'll see this at some point. Given that what are we on YouTube?
So.
We have like
I hope
5
he
subscribers.
responds
So
to
you
us.
can.
Yeah. So the first video is only like 15 minutes long, but then he has a second follow-up video, which I think is the interesting one, which is like 50 minutes long, where he actually goes into some of the math behind the systems to like back up his points, which is like that is the most interesting piece of the puzzle from my perspective. And then there's a bunch of response videos which I thought were fine, but overall not great. There were a lot of people who I felt like had a very condescending answer, which was like, "Oh, just be more creative." He complains about this in the second video, and
Yeah.
I get that complaint because I did watch a response video where somebody was like, "But yeah, if you and your players are just more creative rather than just running the adventure path out of the book, you'll have a good time." And I was like, "That is really patronizing."
No,
Like, oh.
it absolutely is. And just to kind of give you my like 10,000 foot view is like I agree with you. That's super patronizing, but I also think that that's like part of like a real part of the like. I don't want to blame anybody for it, right? But like, I don't think this is a problem that's unique to PF2E. I don't think it's like I think like this is pretty universally true for every version of Dungeons and Dragons that I've played. 3.5 through 5e, PF2e, and PF1e, right? Like I think
Yeah, I did watch a very interesting response video from somebody who's clearly like a very old player. Like this is somebody who's like 40s or 50s who like grew up on like you know AD&D kind of thing, who was talking about like this has been a problem with the system since Wizards took over the license and put out edition 3.0, and this is and he didn't quite say it in these terms, but he was basically like, and this is why AD&D is better, you fucking like youngins.
Yeah, no, and so I've actually seen a couple of these responses, and they seem to fall into one of two categories, which is which is funny because it's because the system is too crunchy, or it's because the system isn't crunchy enough, right? Like,
See, the thing is that I think
that makes
that
sense to
is
me
the
though.
complete it's the complete wrong axis as far as I'm concerned. It's not about the level of crunch. It is about the way in which I guess like the crunch manifests. So to just like headline this, in his second video, he lays out a simple combat scenario, right, where there are two whites, there's a fighter, and then there's the ranger, and the kind of the operative person is the ranger. And it's like, well, what does the ranger do with his action? And he runs the numbers and kind of shows that if the ranger does his basic thing that I just described, right? Hunter's spray, hunter's mark, auto attack, whatever the thing is called. He has a certain amount of damage. If he like average damage, right? If he does a certain subset of other like options, those options are all significantly worse than just doing the thing that his character is like fundamentally like built for. I think that, and he talks about how like the damage fall off from doing that hunter's mark, hunter's prey attack thing, whatever it is like 69% nice. And the ability to change your because I said
Yes.
it's the number.
Yeah.
I don't have a choice. That
Yeah.
was his ability to make different decisions in combat is like completely outmoded by just like the raw mechanical edge of his like of the power of that rotational combo, right? Um, and then he compares it to in D&D 5e where the power is much diminished, right? The rotational combo is still the best in D&D 5e, but it's only the best by like 20%. And you can imagine somebody who makes a decision based on I'm going to lose 20% DPS, but here's some other, you know, like factor DPR, I guess technically. Here's some other factor that makes that worth it, right? Um, it is so much harder to make that argument when you're losing 69% DPR. Do you know what
Right.
I mean?
Yeah.
And then he goes on to further prove that if the ranger actually flanks for the 5e character because advantage is so powerful in 5e, I guess, that the best thing for the ranger to do is actually in that situation is to flank for the fighter so that he and the fighter both get advantageous melee attacks, rather than, you know, his auto thing, which seems like the perfect, you know, like that seems kind of correct to me, right? That if your basic set of kind of actions is overwritten by using the map cleverly, by using position cleverly, by doing anything kind of along those lines, that actually feels like it's what you would generally speaking want, right? Um, and so I feel like that's the core of it. That's the core of the complaint, which isn't a crunch thing. It is just the the power of the base rotational ability, I'll call it, is so high and so out of whack that there is no situational circumstance that could possibly outweigh doing the rotational ability as your turn every turn.
Okay. So, and I think this is my kind of theoretical problem with the case that he lays out, right? Like, I think you're ultimately right, and this is what I mean by like the complaint is like there's either too much crunch or there's not enough crunch, right? Because
Mm,
like if you have a crunchier system, right? Like I see a lot of people referencing like the OS old school revival type stuff, which tends to be a little bit like crunchier, a little bit more simulationist, right? Like that gives you enough variables to play around with that you have to like kind of at least crunch the numbers, or it makes it too hard to crunch the numbers, so you have to like feel it out, so that like more of those differences appear, and so you've got more variables to play with, right? So it makes things less cut and dry, right? Like if you've only got like 4 variables to play with, you can calculate them very quickly and figure out what you need to do. Whereas the other side of that is like if things are fluffier, then you're tied less to the crunch, and so you can make this. It essentially makes that percentage number go down, if that makes sense, right?
mm,
If things, if you're gonna do like a D6 or a D8, like doing one less damage on average isn't the end of the world type of deal, and that's
yeah.
typical more of the fluffier systems. The thing that the fundamental problem that I have with his argument in a couple of ways is like this to me feels like simming on what's the
Oh,
word?
simming on patchwork.
Yeah, simming on patchwork, right? Like
Yeah, this is a WoW thing that Mango is describing, where most simulations in the game just sort of put you up against a generic boss where there are no mechanics and spits out a number, right? You should, in that situation, do for me, it's like 4.7k DPS, right? But in a real raid encounter, you have all these mechanics to worry about. You have to dodge things, you have to move around, you might have to do a specific thing for the raid in order to keep the raid alive. All of those things bring your numbers way down. So in actuality, that sim is not incredibly accurate.
Right, and I think that's a lot of what's happening here, right? Like, putting he picks like I think like a white just because it's like a basic monster, but I think that's part of the problem, right? Like, there are enemies that have different resistances and different buffs, and you're playing on like a flat playing field. I probably got some specific things that I could go into about the 5e example, which kind of like irked me in kind of like a bubble, right? Like, if the answer is to, like, first of all, flanking isn't a core role in D&D. To his credit, he mentions this is just a commonly used variant. But
okay. I was actually confused a little bit about that, but I get that. That makes sense.
If the right answer is so there's three things off the top of my head. One, flanking isn't standard, which is again fine. He called that out. Two, there's rarely a situation where it's just going to be a ranger and a fighter, right? Like, it is not like and the third part of this was that, like, if the right decision is to go into melee and flanking, that's actually worse, because you're saying instead of doing the thing your character is good at, go do this generic thing and flank. And if that's if that's ideal simming on patchwork, then that's always going to be true, right? Like, the right decision is you should always pick the flanking optimized build.
Oh,
right?
Interesting.
But that's I think those last two also kind of counteract each other, right? Like, if that's not a thing you normally have to do and you only occasionally have to do it, okay, I'll buy that, right? Like,
that's actually really interesting though. But I actually see what you're saying, and I think it speaks to this. For instance, I kind of came away from this video thinking, like, why is it that it is so, like, that the advantage to flanking in Pathfinder, for instance, is just +2, right? Like, that's a tiny bonus when you compare it to all of the other sorts of, like, all of the other sorts of things. Because to me, that does seem like the correct thing. Like, I would want to encourage flanking. I would want to encourage my players to have a set of a decision making tree that is interacting fundamentally with the map, right? Like, another point that he makes is that the map actually doesn't really matter for the ranger, because without attacks of opportunity, he just sits there, and even in melee, his optimal choice is to just point blank fire at a guy right in front of him, which wouldn't be possible in, like, Pathfinder 1e, for instance, because of attacks of opportunity and stuff like that. But I think that actually does have an answer, which is that if the correct way to beat any combat encounter is to just use these generic positional advantages that anyone can take advantage of, right? I can flank with a wizard, I can flank with a sorcerer, I can flank with whoever, right? All you're really doing is substituting one lack of choice for another lack of choice, if that makes sense, right? Like, then all that happens is the player who is rotationally, right, hunters play, hunters mark, strike, he is now just rotationally stride into flanking to a melee attack strike, right? Because, like, this is sort of like the numerically correct thing to do. And that is an interesting point. I guess I agree with you.
yeah, and so I think another part of this too, is that like, and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, and this he just stumbled onto the wrongest one. But, like, I think this is worst for the range class, and I think this is just because range combat in these games is not particularly suited to dynamism, right? I think this is part of the problem that we had with Starfinder, right? Like that,
Yeah,
like,
we've talked about this with Starfinder a lot.
yeah, like range combat tends to be a lot of stand in place and shoot type stuff, and it's hard to really force that. Like, whereas in melee combat, you at least have some dynamism there. But I do think I do think that he's got some really valid points. Like, I think the point that rang the most true to me was the magic missile point. So the magic missile in PF2E has this really cool thing that they did where, like, you can spend up to 3 actions on it, and each action adds another missile, right? And in theory, this means that you've got a lot of flexibility with magic missile. In practice, this means you don't cast magic missile until you have 3 actions to spend it. And I think that was his argument. I think that holds fairly true. I think it works. I think the system works better in other situations, right? Like, I think the best use of this is the basic heal spell has has this scaling thing, but it does different things, right? One action is 1d8 or it's spell level d8 at touch range. Two actions is spell level d8 at like I think it's 30-foot range plus like a +8 plus 8 damage per spell level, right? So or 8 healing per spell level, right? So instead of so for the level 1 version of this, one action is 1d8 at touch, two action is 1d8 plus 8, and then the three action is 1d8 but in a 30-foot radius.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it changes the core functionality of the spell.
Yeah.
You have to either be in melee, right? You can target it single target, or it's a big AoE. That's
Yeah.
actually very clever compared to the magic missile example, I guess.
No, it absolutely, and I think, I think the other part of this too is like just like kind of the nature of healing, right? Like because healing is kind of like a more essential like at least kind of like I think if you ran the numbers, it wouldn't come out this way, but at least in the way it feels, right? Like healing is a more essential function, right? So like if someone's about to go down, I'm willing to burn. Like I play a cleric in one of the 2e games that I play, and I most commonly use that 2 action, right? It gives me the flexibility to move. I don't have to worry about accidentally catching, an enemy in my 30-foot radius, right, and like healing them up. But like there'll be times when it's like, well, you're gonna die, and I don't have the action economy, so I need to burn, the one action heal, in order to make sure that you stay alive, right? Or like it works out that way. I also have enough of them. I've got like 4 or 5. I've got 4 or 5 of them base as a cleric at level. I think we're level 8 now. And so like it feels like you have the freedom. Whereas with magic missile, right? Like it's like it just feels like a waste. If you're burning like the lower, like you want it like because like you said, the functionality doesn't change at all. It doesn't have as that kind of flexibility to it. And I think it would work if somehow like it would be too powerful if it was, but like cantrips are castable infinitely, right? So like if you had that kind of mechanic on a cantrip, I think it'd be fine, right? Because it's like, well, on this turn, I have the opportunity to, I have the opportunity to spend all 3 actions, so I will. But otherwise, because that's essentially like striking 3 times, right? Like it balances out differently. Again, I don't think the math works here, but I think like figuring out how to make that work in that scenario, I think would make the system work better. But I don't know. How you do that in a way.
Yeah, because there's a huge penalty to going strike, right? There's that multi-attack penalty.
Yeah, it's
in
-5
Pathfinder
and then
Second
-10.
Edition, which is like, why would anybody ever do that? And I guess I get it because you don't want people to just sit there and burn all 3 of their moves on a single auto, but or on like a single full attack sort of thing. But like,
So
I don't know.
the funny thing is, I think that system works really well, right? Because it means that you
Really?
like so the second attack isn't out of reach, and then like if you're like a fighter, that third attack, especially if you're like let's say you're going up against a bunch like a big dude with a bunch of mooks, the third attack as a fighter can probably hit one of those mooks, right? Like,
Interesting.
or at least it's like got like at least 50-50 odds of it. Plus there are other optimizations, right? Like weapons with the agile property, do -1, it's -4, -8 instead of -5, -10. What was the other part of this that I thought was clever? Oh, like big weapons, right? Like hammers have a backswing, which is if you miss the first one, the second one's only -4, right? So you can probably get a hit in on the on a turn. And it does discourage that third attack, but like it's the way it works out in practice is like you try and do something more useful, and if you can't, you're like, well, I'll go for the Hail Mary, and if you hit it, it feels like, hey, it's not, it doesn't feel as good as a crit, but it's kind of in that territory. And like I said, it makes more sense for in practice, it makes more sense for the martial character. It doesn't really make a lot of sense for the for like my character as a cleric doesn't have a lot of bonuses in that department. I'm under I'm not at maximum bonus on strength. So I am almost never rolling that third strike. Instead, I'll try and do something like an intimidate, or I'll cast a spell, right? Like I've got another game I'm playing I call affectionately a punch wizard, and like that's like perfect. Like if I'm next to somebody, I'll do a strike, and then I'll do a 2-action cantrip, which forces a save instead of rolling a spell attack roll, and those don't stack the penalties. And, like I think that the system's super interesting in its ability to build that way, but ultimately those are also rotations that I'm describing, right? So
Yeah.
I think those filter in. Um, but again, I'm thinking I'm gonna roll back this. I think this is true of kind of every game of this style, like any kind of like moderately crunchy game, right? Because I don't think we get games that are crunchy enough here or in this era to like make excuse me like make you consider like have to consider enough factors that you choose something else on purely kind of like on pure factors that wouldn't be apparent to you from
I
the
mean, even
outset.
Star Wars is sort of this, right? Like, it is just mechanically superior. I was thinking about this. I, for a long time, wanted to go for a sort of hybrid, commandoized version of Omega. Omega has a third point in Brawn. I was thinking about raising that other point in Brawn so that he could also sort of melee, and I also have quick draw, right? So, like, he could quick draw out his pistols into a weapon and like swap to melee or whatever. But I was just kind of like, what a poor investment on a character creation level for something that would very rarely benefit me in actual combat. Like when would it be more worth it for me to step into melee rather than to stay in short plinking away with my double, like with my double guns. I'm essentially doubling the investment of experience points because I need to keep my melee stat, and my brawn up with my agility and my whatever light guns stat. I would need to own a powerful melee weapon, just like I owned a pair of powerful pistols, just like all of these other sorts of things. And when I got into that situation, right, like even though that was sort of the fantasy that I had foreseen for myself, it actually didn't make any real sense. And the funny part is the part it would have made a lot of sense because in theory, in my head, it was sort of a stealth thing, like Omega can kill somebody with a knife, or a vibro sword or something before they have a chance to react. Because part of his thing is like getting the drop on, starting with stealth, having these sort of like ambushes, right? Um, and even in that scenario, which we were just in the heist, it was just so clear that the right thing to do was to just shoot the guys from range. So I do think that I agree with you that it is like a more core problem. And I think that is a core problem that doesn't have, this is part of my other thing with like rotations. I think I do agree that rotations are ultimately pretty bad for D&D and Pathfinder, but like part of that is because they don't have this isn't a ding on rotations as a system. It is just that rotations as a system are more complex in a computerized MMORPG than in a tabletop RPG, and have so many more tools to make rotations interesting. So for instance, you never have procs, right? In When I'm playing my arms warrior, I have procs that I need to keep aware of, right? I have specific numerical resources that I'm constantly like watching and making decisions about how I'm going to, react to these sorts of things, right? When I'm at a certain amount of energy or I have a certain amount of rage, I'm going to make different decisions. When I'm at a low amount of rage, right? I have cooldown abilities, right? With cooldowns that are going to come up, and I want to time those cooldowns for very like specific windows. And I can't precisely time them because I know down to the second when they are going to like come up and stuff. None of those I have options for in D&D. There are no Pathfinder or Dungeons and Dragons versions of really any of those things to be a as fulfilling, I guess, a game system as a generic MMO rotation can be fulfilling. Not to mention, by the way, that there are different types of rotations that Dungeons and Dragons just can't even support, right? Like I can play an assassination rogue, which is all about applying bleeds and poisons to my target, which is entirely impossible to play in D&D because there's really not a lot of support for dots, right? You can't have a dot spec in
Yeah,
D&D
yeah.
the way that you can have a dot spec in an MMORPG. You can't have a proc, right? Like Frost Mage is historically a very hardcore proc spec where you're constantly watching to see where your procs are coming from and responding to the procs as they come out. You just can't do that in Dungeons and Dragons, which I think is a tough limiting factor and why these rotations feel shitty, I guess, for like the worst affected players. I will say that I think, and this is something the guy says in the video, that like spellcasting, because it's such a limited resource, kind of gets away with this in a lot of ways, which makes sense to me because like your spells are very limited. You are constantly having to make that calculus of, do I burn my lightning bolt here or do I wait for a better line that I'm gonna really like sail it through, right? Like there's always another encounter that might have a more useful time for me to burn that lightning bolt. That's fair enough, but I feel like for a lot of these rotational characters, it is just rough.
Yeah, it's funny because you say there's no like dot spec, but like I don't. There's no support for like going hard on it, but there are like dot like abilities in 2e, right? Like so the way that bleed and there's a couple other abilities that work like it's called persistent damage works now is you apply the effect to an enemy at the end of their turn or on you if it's on you is you roll the damage and then you roll a DC 15 flat check, and if you pass it, the effect drops off. But like
Hmm.
I put bleeds on people a lot. Like that's like just like happens to be one of the things that like my cleric got good at. It's like there's a spell that as reaction can apply bleed to somebody. If you get like it makes sense for the character. But like there are ways to get that. But I think you're ultimately right. Like you can't pop a buff that gives you 15% more damage because like you know, asking somebody to be like, "Oh, right, now calculate 15% of your damage and add it on top." Is like a lift that. And there are things that are like close to that, right? Like you can get like extra damage dice, but like it's essentially a little too great. You don't want to have too many things to track because of just the lift of tracking things in the pen and paper
Well,
context.
yeah, that's exactly what I mean about dots, right? Like in a true dot spec, when I'm playing, like if I think about an assassination rogue being played in Pathfinder, it would have all of these rules that would just be impossible to follow. Because not only so it's three, it's not just one bleed, it's three. You have garrot, uh not mutilate. Mutilate is the other thing. Rupture and deadly poison, right? All of those are on different timers, right? Garrot lasts 18 seconds, deadly poison lasts 12 seconds, and rupture lasts 24 seconds. And then rupture you have to apply with combo points. Garrot you can just apply whenever, but it has a 6-second internal cooldown, so you can't just garrot. Like you have all of these other factors that you can kind of account for. And as a player, I can engage with these systems and find like a really and also every time so one of the core pieces of the assassination spec is that every time a bleed ticks on a target that is currently suffering from poison, right, you gain 7 energy, right? So what happens is you are filling your energy bar by having these bleeds constantly like tick over and over and over again, right? So you'd have to have additional rules that say, oh well, when your garrot or rupture triggers, you're getting more, like you're getting more bleeds here. And this creates a really complicated but interesting rotation, right? If I'm in a Mythic Plus dungeon as a assassination rogue, I'm going to take a certain talent build that lets me apply 3 garrots from stealth so I can get a garrot on 3 different targets. All of those will apply. I'll get poisons on all of those targets, and then I'm just swimming in energy for the rest of the trash pack because my garrots are ticking and I'm like constantly spam generating like the energy. Or I have a 2 target boss where it's like, okay, first I want to garrot rupture this guy, then we're gonna garrot rupture the second guy, and we're gonna constantly keeping the dots rolling as we go. That stuff, it's just completely unsupported in D&D, and I think it is a limitation of nobody wants to track that many conditions. Nobody
Yeah.
wants to track you know that many like incidentals, I guess I would call them, right? Like these things that happen as these triggered things, right? They're not even actions, they're just triggered events that pop off at certain points. It would just become completely, like kind of completely unwieldy. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. No.
And then cooldowns are also a weird thing in D&D. Like you have this is something that fourth edition did that I think was very hard and people really didn't like this, right? Which was like I have certain per encounter abilities, I have certain per day abilities, and it's like managing those kinds of cooldowns is like a huge pain.
Yeah. No. But so they kind of have that in PF2, and I think it works fine. I think mostly because like they're not as universal and they're much more limited, right? Like spells are essentially a per day ability, and there are like focus points, and D&D 5e has this too, where it's like if you take like a short rest in D&D, it's an hour. In PF2e, it's 10 minutes, but like you can refocus and get your short term abilities back. Um, which I think works pretty okay. There's not as many of them, so it doesn't feel like you have to keep track of them as much. The other recharging ability is like roll a d6 on a 5 or a 6. recharge the ability or whatever.
Yeah.
Which I think is smart from like clever rather from a mechanics perspective, right? Because like then you don't have to keep track of a cooldown. Like you just like on your turn roll the die, and if it comes up, but it can be incredibly frustrating from like a um from just like a usage perspective, right? Because if you roll it like if you roll like 3 ones in a row, you're like, well, fuck, I can't use my ability, right? Like,
So
um,
that players have that ability. Excuse me.
um,
Players have that ability because I know in fourth edition, which I agree by the way. Phelan chat says fourth edition best edition. In fourth edition, monsters had that ability, but I didn't know that it got to players because
I
that's interesting. That's kind of like a proc in a way.
yeah, I don't know if I've seen it. I think I haven't seen that ability that I can use, but I thought I saw somebody at one of my tables be able to use one of those.
Interesting.
But it's definitely not like a core thing, right? Like it's like it's an exception rather than the rule.
Sure.
Um, at some point, um, there was one other thing I wanted to talk about. Um, I that I thought was like not a great point from his perspective, which is his claim that like so I think he's talking about like the combat versus the social encounter type stuff. I think he's ultimately right, like that PF that the PF2E D&D family of games like ultimately is very combat centric. I think there's no escaping that. I think this is actually what kind of saves the Star Wars FFG game is that like even though there's combat is like heavily rotational like we've described, most of the game actually isn't that at all.
Yeah, I agree with you a lot. I
But
also think, and I will. I also think there's a quirk of the dice, but we can talk about that in a bit. Finish your point.
so the other thing he said was that like social encounters don't matter because the system is so simple in terms of like roll a d20, add your or diplomacy to persuade somebody, and like that just seems to be like so disconnected from the way that the people actually play the game. Like, and I think it's perfectly fair to criticize it from a systems level perspective, but again, this is a thing that's been true for literally every version of this family of games forever, and people have solutions. Like we have a whole podcast about how we would solve this problem mechanically that we did like a couple of years ago. That I we should maybe re-examine that just because I think it's an interesting topic to go over again. But I find that criticism rings pretty hollow in terms of like a thing that like makes the game bad, right? Like a reason why I would abandon it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I also feel that. I think I empathize with his answer because I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think that a lot of people it does make a lot of sense to basically ignore like there was something that he talked about where there was the crunch in the diplomacy system, which is very fair, right? Which is like the I'm gonna do this to introduce improve his attitude towards us one step or whatever, and I just like all that stuff is like very rough, I feel like. But I do think that I agree that like it's a very fair solution to just sort of wash your hands of it and say like, you know what, most of these social encounters are just going to be role play where we are going to be kind of ignoring the dice more or less, maybe making some odd rolls as like skill checks, something kind of along those lines, but like for the most part, right, we're like not really going to be worrying about it. That's actually an interesting point to me because the thing that I thought was really interesting about D&D, or I'm sorry, about Pathfinder Second Edition was like the expertise that one can attain in different skills, right? And specifically the way that it like how does exploration turn out in your experience with the game in terms of like dungeon crawling, right? Like they talk about there's the social situations, the exploration, and the combat as sort of like the three modes of play. And the one that I thought was really interesting there was exploration, kind of like creating this like space for trap finding, for skill checks, for all of those kinds of decisions to be made outside of the context of combat.
So it's interesting because the apparently the popular opinion on the internet is the AP that I'm playing, Age of Ashes, is I think it's Age of Ashes. It's the first AP is a little bit overtuned, and lethal. Um, but we there's the exploration element, and we've been using those mechanics, but it kind of falls into this trap that I found is pretty common with kind of a lot of these search mechanics, which is like it's like an up down check, and if you make it, if you make the check, you're good, and if you don't make the check, you're bad, and because it's all like preordained, right? Like it doesn't feel great, right? Like it's like yeah, I'm the way it usually works out is like one of us is navigating, two of us are doing various skill checks, right? Like, somebody's like searching and somebody's like casting like detect magic. And then like maybe somebody else is like, using survival to like look for something, right? And like those are neat decisions that you make, but you make them once and then it's like, 2 weeks of game time that's just, kind of like making the same checks over and over and over again.
Okay, that's interesting.
Um,
Yeah, I remember having a very hard time with this when I was designing dungeons for Hell's Rebels, right? Like where I was like, you can't you it you can never put something behind a skill check that if they fail they lose,
right.
right? Like you always have to be able to effectively clear the dungeon and get to the back of it um without without the danger of ever failing a skill check, which kind of turns all of those skill checks into this like optional thing where it's like, and like I very vividly remember there was one piece of one dungeon that you guys never figured out. You got a hint for it, and maybe you investigated it, but it was just like I think it was in the underground. Do you remember like that was that underground layer? Um, it was like it was like partially underwater. There was a safe somewhere where if you figured it out, you could swim down a hole. There's a safe at the bottom of this hole. You could crack the safe, get a bunch of money, something like that. And you guys got a clue for it, and you didn't follow up, or you whiffed the skill check or whatever, and we all just moved on with our life. But because like nobody knows,
Yeah, that's the thing is,
it's completely meaningless, and then it sucks for me because it feels like, man, like I just I probably spent half an hour figuring all this shit out, right? Like, and the players whiff one check or decide not to think about what the cryptic note might mean or whatever and move on. And it's just like that part sucks. That really sucks, and I
yeah.
wish that there was like a better way to handle it.
And so I think this is interesting because like I think it's actually harder to accomplish well on kind of, so this is overland exploration that I'm doing in this, right? It's like the standard hex place exploration. I think it's
Mhm.
actually harder to pull off there because it's like a much more macro level. I think on the dungeon level you
Yeah.
could do it right, but you have to do it in places where people like you know what the issue is. And I think the simplest version of this, and this is also the most common version, is if you make the perception check, you get the drop on the enemy, and if you whiff it, you enter combat immediately, or maybe they get the drop on you, right? If that situation happens, and I think that's a pretty good use of that. The problem is specifically for PF2E is perception is like very much directly tied to your buddy. You just like zoomed in like 3 times on your camera. Um,
What happened?
look at your.
What the what the fuck? What what?
uh, anyway, in PF2E, right, and I think in a lot of the games, perception is like not a thing that you have a lot of fine control over, right? Like in PF2E, it's very closely tied to your character, um, like your character class, and you don't really get to bump that. You can't be like, I'm good at perception. There are a couple ways to tweak that, but like it's outside the core kind of like other skills you have much more control over, and it's much harder to build, I think, encounters around that kind of thing, right? Like I think you could, right? You could be like, oh well, you could get into the next room if you climbed up on this ledge, but and you need to make somebody has to see that and be like, I want to do that, and like make the athletic checks to climb up on the ledge because there's no ladder there or whatever, right? Like, um, and I do think that this does. I think that this works better than people think it does because I think it does actually come out kind of naturally, right? Like, something that's very common that kind of happens in this Age of Ashes game that I'm playing is, of the 4 characters, 3 of them have stealth, and my character doesn't. My character will stand very still while everybody else fans out and does stealth, and then my character will do kind of like the hail citizen type thing, right? Like, and like engage the enemy, and then everybody else will jump out of ambush, and like that's built around our skill specializations, right?
Yeah.
And that's like something that like we know going into it, and I think that kind of shapes plans more than people want to recognize it does, right? It's like oh, if everybody has athletics, we can do the thing that lets us get the drop from the upper edge, or the character that does have athletics can go do that. I think it's just a matter of having like maps that let you take advantage of it, right? Like I forgot the name of the character again, but like simming on the open plane just is never going to be interesting. What's the character's name again? Patchwork. Yeah, Patchwork on the open plane is never.
Yeah, Patchwork is a famous boss from Naxxramas in the original vanilla WoW whose only mechanic was that he hits the guy next to the tank just as hard as he hits the tank, right? So essentially, when he hits one person, it auto cleaves his damage to the second person. So there's no mechanics for DPS to worry about. They just sit behind Patchwork and they go hard. He also has a very short. He only has a 5 minute enrage timer, which meant that he was a gear check, right? Like you basically killed him or you didn't, sort of thing.
Yeah.
There are bosses who are now in WoW called Patchwork who are sort of like that, but like they're far more complicated, right? Like Sludge Fist is a good example. Sludge Fist is the Patchwork fight of uh of Castle Nathria because he's like a big DPS check, because his enrage timer is also very short. It's also 5 minutes, right? Effectively. But like there's way more mechanics
Yeah.
on Sludge Fist than there are on, on Patchwork.
Yeah, no, and I honestly I think that those WoW's I think a slightly different story because it's 13 years old and it really is like core rotations. But I think for D&D, right, like having a very kind of core like DPS down the enemy's fight is good. I don't think it's great for boss encounter because at some point it just feels spongy and then you really feel that deep, like the rotations thing in there. I think it's actually a lesson we can pull from it, right? Like part of what makes the Patrick fight at least a little bit interesting is the short range timer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think carrying it over, you want these kind of like core fights where you're only doing the thing that your character is good at to be short, right? You want them to be done in like 3 or 4 rounds rather than being like
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this a million times, right? Like, so many of those high level encounters you guys were having in Hell's Rebels were not about just killing the enemy. We always talk about the rhinos at the inn because I feel like it's the most evocative example, but
yeah,
it's like, yes, if the goal of the fight is to protect a couple of very squishy NPCs from rhinos who are charging they're effectively an environmental hazard, right?
right,
But even there, I'm just like making up tons and tons of extra rules that this kind of comes into the be more creative thing that
yeah,
I do think is like shitty and patronizing or whatever. And part of that is like those aren't the rules. The rules of the game don't support this, right? Like I had to effectively just create and rule zero in all of these extra mechanics to make up for the fact that high level combat was not incredibly interesting in like late edition first edition
PF20,
Pathfinder.
yeah.
Yeah. And so like if you have to do that, there is probably a problem in your system to a certain extent. And it is more indicative of the Taking 20 guy's point than it is a solution to his problem, right?
Right. Yeah. No,
Um
I agree, and especially like just running things out of APs is tough to do. But like, I like, so I agree. I will agree 100%. This is a problem, but I don't think it's a problem that's unique to PF2E. And I think that's my biggest problem with it. Is like he like at least it came across to me as like this is why I'm going back to D&D 5e. It's like, well, D&D 5e has largely the same problems. In fact, I think I've got like
mhm.
less. I feel more constrained in my D&D 5e character than I do in my um, PF2e character. Um,
Really? That's interesting.
I mean,
See, the thing I liked about D&D, I haven't played either of these systems deeply, but the thing that I liked about D&D 5e for the one shots I played at Gen Con was so much of the stuff seemed open-ended, right? Like I played a version of Gondor who was a conjurer. Um, and conjurers have this like cantric ability to just like if you can imagine an object in a 3 by 3 cube, essentially, you can conjure that object. And I was constantly conjuring dumb shit. Like, like conjuring boxes, conjuring whatever, just like conjuring stuff to temporarily help us with stuff. I feel like those sorts of open-ended mechanics don't exist in Pathfinder. Is that something you feel, or is that a misconception on my
so
part?
so how often were you doing that in the middle of combat?
That's fair. Rarely,
You're
I
right.
guess. Rarely.
So I think there are similar things you can do. I don't think they're as accessible on the cantrip level. I actually think that this is a fundamental problem with kind of the way the systems both systems are built. I think D&D 5 is a little bit better about it. Is that like if you're splitting your spell casting between like utility and combat's gonna win every time, right? Like, and so like like the fact that it's a cantrip that your conjurer has, I think is really smart design. And I don't think that I've seen like there might be some equivalent, but like the best thing you can do, I think, in PF2E is like get to a high enough level where your first level spell slots are effectively who cares, right? Until you can put some utility in there, um, which
Yeah.
is
Or
not a
you
great
make the
solution.
decision to gimp your character. Like,
Yeah.
I do have a version. I did also play in another D&D game with Gondor where all of his first level spell slots were essentially out of combat utility spells. There's like friend, charm person, right? Like all that stuff. And I was the face of the party at that point. With the only thing I could really do in combat be like cast like flame jet, flame.
The cancer,
The cantrip, shoot a fireball. That's it, right? Like, I don't know. I definitely do get that. I definitely do get that for sure. Do you feel like this is something that like you expect? So okay, to put this another way, on the video itself, Paizo reacted and they praised the comment. They were saying we really enjoy constructive criticism. Thanks for laying out all this. We have some more products that are coming out this year that we're hoping are going to address some of these issues. Do you like what do you want to see in those products? In if they are releasing a new book or a new whatever, what do you think needs to be in that book in order to make the game stronger
So
and
honestly, I think that there's a good solution that's already out there, that's already in one of the books, and it's the free archetype variant. It screws with the balance a little bit, but like you give your players a free archetype and they get an archetype feat every other level. Your characters end up a little bit more powerful, but it's mostly just more options, right? Like I was calling this back when I think when we had the beta play test in our hands.
yeah.
If you remember, I said this like just like let your players pick a second, a second feat, and you can get 2 trees instead of one, and then you've got like more like
Yeah, no,
yes,
I remember you talking about this actually.
it's like yes, it's two, you're choosing between two of optimal DPR choices, but at least that's like a choice there, right? Like at least it like feel like, and I think there's enough wiggle room in the system that like it's already not so bad, right? Right, like whether or not I'm doing a grapple or a strike is a real choice that I make a lot on my cleric, right? And maybe this is weird because it's a cleric, right? As opposed to, and like my math is a little bit fuzzier, and so it's not as optimal as the fighter, so it doesn't matter as much. Um, or like whether I'm making an intimidate check or not, or how I'm positioning myself, all that kind of stuff, like how difficult it is to do any of these individual things. Um, like I think just like having a little bit more choice there, like adding in another like the free archetype rule, I think solves it pretty well. If like a way to canonize that a little bit better is a thing I think would be a good way to bring it in.
What this reminds me of is like we did this in a couple like Mark did this in his game, and I think I copied it into Hell's Rebels where we were getting a lot of um where we were getting bonus feats, but the feats were from specific like you would get like a pool and it would be only like non-combat stuff, right? You would get
Yeah,
these bonus feats that you could apply to social situations. Oh well, no, what I did was I gave everybody a free skill point, but they had to apply it to
to a
like
social.
a non-combat like social skill,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like
yeah.
um and I think I do agree with you. um that actually makes a lot of that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I'd have to like really look at the what's it called at the numbers to like figure out like if that's like a little too broken. Like if you're just like, well, I'm going to gish as hard as possible, and I will be like a wizard sorcerer, right? And that just means I have a larger spell pool, right? Like maybe that like just gets like puts you off the deep end a little bit too much. But uh uh but I think I don't know how you build that in a way in like in the later products. Like, but I also think the later products will help with this because you're not just gonna have a larger pool of things to choose from. Um, and if you have a larger pool of things to choose from, I think that like it just helps if that makes sense, right? Like, um, you feel like and I think it doesn't solve the core problem of like iterative combat, but I think it like at least I think it helps a little bit, right? Like I think I don't know. I don't know what they could put in there to make it work past that, but I'm excited to see it, right? Like I like the system a lot. I think of all like I think that like I think 4E is something different, and I think it has its place. But I think of all like I like 5E and I like 2E for different reasons. But I do think that they're the best versions of the games that we've had so far, right? Like I wouldn't go back to 3.5. Um,
You want to go back to Pathfinder first edition?
um, the only reason I would be just for like things that aren't in 2E yet, right? Like there's no gunslinger, like there's a gunslinger playtest, but like um, and it's not like I'd be like if someone was like I'm running a 1E game and that was either that or nothing, I'd be like no, like throw a book at them or something. But like I would
Yeah, I there's so much I still want to do in 1E. That's my thing with 1E is that I like a lot of these 1E classes, and I have concepts, like character concepts for like I want to play a shifter, I want to play a hunter, I want to play like all of these different kinds of characters, but I guess I would have to either update them for when those characters maybe eventually maybe make it to 2e. I don't think that certain of them will. I don't think a hunter will ever be playable in 2e, but
Yeah,
yeah,
I think the hunter and the shifter are pretty well represented in the druid and
druid
the
and yeah.
ranger, just because they because you've got, like, instead of getting everything on the druid, you get like one of the three kind of main things for the most part.
Yeah, and now you have like hardcore subclasses. Man, I have so many druid concepts, which is funny because like in WoW I really hate druid. Like druid is my least played class. I don't like it in really any of its specs, though I do have a max level one just for farming ore. Um, and in D&D, it's like the class I probably have the most number of like iterative builds for, because like there is the wild, like the shapeshifting kind of druid. There's the caster druid, the ninth level caster druid. There's the animal companion druids. I just like there's just a lot going on in druid that is really fun in a Dungeons and Dragons setting.
So honestly, and I have similar instincts, but I have found that I mostly don't actually want to play those. Is I want to build them and imagine playing them, and like maybe play them once per session, right?
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't think like any of my 300 dumb Pathfinder one character builds. Like, I think I would have fun playing them all through a campaign, but I don't think I need to actually like kind of like scratch that itch,
Fair
right?
enough. See,
Like,
I actually think to wrap this sort of all the way around, I think that this is part of the misunderstanding that people had. A lot of people who were talking about like the illusion of choice were talking on this level. They were talking on the character creation level. They were like, "Oh, well, you can build your character differently. Take different feats. You don't always have to take the best feat that's going to add the most damage or whatever." Which is like, fair enough, but that's not what Cody was talking about in his video. But I do actually think that it is elucidating towards a it's elucidating kind of like towards what he's talking about a little bit, and why the systems that are frustrating him exist in the first place, right? Like I talked about that 69% earlier. The reason that exists is because it feels good to look at a feat and go, oh my god, that's really powerful, I'm going to
right.
select that. In the same way that it feels good to look at a Hearthstone card and go, holy shit, this would be perfect for my zoo deck, right? Like, and add that to the thing. Like the act of making those choices in character creation is a really satisfying thing. And I think that's the reason that so much power is kind of in the game on that level rather than on the level of just flanking, right?
Yeah.
Because you want people to kind of create these builds and then reap the reward of those builds. I also feel you, by the way. Phelan chat says, first of all, Lou in chat says, we druids hate you too. Noted. And then Phelan chat says, I remember building so many 4E characters but never playing many of them. I also know that feeling. But the thing is that as a DM, you can make those characters as NPCs, which I did a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah, no, honestly, I think that's so it's funny because thinking about it, right? Like, I enjoy my long-term characters for things that are related to their class but aren't necessarily like anchored in it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like I could make a like I enjoy, say, Log, right? Like Log from the 4E game we played, right? Because of like who he is as a character, and he's made several return appearances, in
Yep.
various in sundry ways. And I can play a whole campaign as Log, but that is not solely tied to the fact that he was a 4E tree or a like plant tree warden in 4E. Um, like that definitely helped it. That definitely breathed life into the concept. But like he could have probably been like a druid of some sort, right? Or like some sort of like fighter with nature theming, which is what he is sometimes, right? Like
Yeah, that's a real problem that I run into a lot because I always want to reimagine my core characters like Gond or Tonrik, right? Um, and that's a problem that I run into with Tonrik a lot because part of what I like about Tonrik is one-handing two-handers, right? But the only way to activate that in a lot of systems is with mechanics that I don't like or enjoy, and that frustrates me. It's like I want to create the perfect Tondrick, but I can't because there's no good way for me to make his like the rules that I want to use for him legitimate, like real.
so what's this mechanic again? Sorry.
So Tondrick's thing is Titan's Grip, is like
Right.
the Fury
Okay.
Warrior, where you are dual wielding two-handed weapons, right? So
Right.
like a paladin will have a two-hander, you'll have one in each hand, right? Um, and there are rules for that in Pathfinder First Edition for a barbarian to do that, but I don't like the idea of Tonic as a barbarian because it's not really his thing. Um, and so it was just like kind of trying to find that like fantasy even in a system as complex as First Edition was just like freaking impossible, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I eventually figured out that Tunrick was a slayer, because there were certain rules about ranger, like you dual wielding ranger feats that let you dual wield bastard swords, which I was like close enough,
Yeah.
right?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
because part of it is that you have to be wielding a light weapon in your offhand, and you can't do that with like a two-hander, right? A two-hander is never going to be a light
Light
weapon or
weapon. Yeah.
whatever, but the ranger has certain feats that allow you to ignore that problem, that are or class features. They're not even feats, they're class features specifically. And so I was like, Tanner would be a slayer because of that, because he wouldn't have any of the nature shit that goes with ranger, right? Like spell
Yeah. Yeah.
casting, any of that.
Yeah. Yeah. No. And I definitely feel you. I think part of it, though, like at least for me, part of it is definitely like because it's so hard to accomplish, like figuring out the way to do it is at least for me like a supreme source of satisfaction, right? Like the whole punch wizard concept was like a weird way for me to figure out how to like it doesn't work if it's very easy to do for me to like enjoy it, right? It's well, like the wizard can the whole punch wizard concept came about because like it was like I just need to get like proficiency with a gauntlet that like covers like because it's like a punch, it's close enough to a punch, and then like um this is like a weird PF1 thing, but there was like this armored skirt thing that like was a light proficiency and like had like some like like you could substitute it on a piece of armor, but it technically had an ACP of 0, so using it untrained didn't have any like real ill effects. So like it was just like I'm gonna be a wizard with this armored skirt that'll give me this +1 bonus, and that'll be that'll justify this whole character concept, right? Like, and it really didn't. But like, hey, I built this character in 2. He uses mage armor, and like he just like stylistically wears his wizard robes with the the top tied around his waist, and he just like punches, because unarmed strikes are simple weapons now, so anybody can use them.
Mm-hmm.
But that's like that's like this is my kind of like good enough moment. It's like, okay, the system isn't quite as niche and crunchy, so I don't feel as bad about not finding the kind of like thing. But that's
Yeah, and honestly, sometimes crunch for crunch's sake is just like Colbjorn is this crunch for crunch's sake,
yeah,
basically, right? Like, it was just incredibly satisfying to play Colbjorn Foss, whose whole character concept was if I get a trip off, I have a zillion attacks of opportunity, and it triggers all of these like, ore 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 attacks of opportunity, and that's his character, right? That's the way his character works. I bet a bunch of people, like I wonder if I were to look at some of like the really hardcore Pathfinder forums, if they would say that that's like the best build for first edition brawler, right? Um, because I do think it's very high DPR, but if something is not trippable, boy,
yeah,
am I host, right? Like,
yeah. And Fail, you definitely should try PF2E. It's a lot of fun. But actually, so this is a thing I saw in one of the videos that I thought was interesting. Is like, and I don't think I can say I agree. I like my sense is that it's true, but it's that PF2E wants you to play as a party more than it wants you to play as your own character, right? So like you want
oh, interesting.
right like you want to be doing a thing so that the rest of your party is more successful. Honestly, so I kind of like naturally like stumbled into this on my punch wizard character because fists are natural weapons, and so you need like magic fang in order to enhance that. But like I'm a transmutationist, right? So I have like magic weapon as a spell, and I just cast it on the fighter, right? Like it makes much more sense for the guy two-handing the bastard sword to go, get the extra dice. It's like, oh, I want to make myself more powerful, but it's like, it works, right? And like this happens too with my cleric, right? It's a lot of kind of like, oh, I intimidate someone, or oh, I grapple someone, because he's a Hell Knight, and one of the Hell Knight orders lets you like use a flail to like grapple people, It's pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like, I do that, and then like, the fighter and the rogue wail on the thing, and everybody's happy, right? Like, um, and so like, my sense is that that's true. I haven't done the math, but and I think that's kind of why part of the other reason why I want to push back on the math in his follow up video. Not because I don't think he's right in a vacuum, but like, a ranger and a fighter, as opposed to like, a typical party of at least three, right? Like, there's multiplying effects for those kinds of things. And I think the math gets
Yeah.
fuzzy enough there that like, maybe if I went and I did all the math, I'd find out there was a superior option, but it's not so obvious to me that it's a choice I feel I have to make.
Yeah, I do think I agree with this, because this is another piece I was thinking about, which is just that like in most fights you don't have just like the two whites. I mean, sometimes you do. Fuck, sorry. But I'm thinking about like, if I of course this is where I'm gonna go with it. In Mythic Dungeons, a lot of the times, the groups are not just four groups of a single mob, right? You have this guy that does this thing, this guy that does that thing, this guy that does this thing. And as a group, right, like if you're a high level Mythic Plus player, you understand, oh, okay, we need to focus down this spellcaster first, because for whatever reason he's the most dangerous mob among this pack of mobs. And so your decision making isn't about casting Mortal Strike, casting Whirlwind, casting Overpower, right? It's not, my decision making has nothing to do with my rotation. My rotation is almost in the back of my head at that point, right? Like the decisions that are going made into what button I am pressing. All of my decision making when I'm at this point is, what target am I focusing on? When am I going to, use my interrupt? When am I going to stun the target, right? And I think that that's a pretty fair piece of the puzzle that isn't necessarily like talked about. And as encounters get bigger and more complicated, right? Like, I think that there is a real decision that happens. There's a real choice that gets made that kind of counteracts Cody's point about the illusion of choice, which is in a group of four little skeleton warriors and a lich in the back. Does the ranger attack the skeleton warriors, or does he attack the lich? Maybe the skeleton warriors are weak enough that he could one shot him. Maybe the lich is at range, so his melee party members can't get there, and so the softening that target up for a little bit later is the right choice. I think there's a real tactical choice there, right? And I think that in a lot of encounters that tactical choice does exist, and that tactical choice has nothing to do with his rotation, right, or his rotational abilities. It is about where is the targeting for those rotational abilities going, right? What do we think the most difficult mob is? Where do we want to put your average 17.55 DPR, right? As a strategic choice. That actually does make sense to me. And I think it's probably, if I were to like push back hard, it would probably be like the thing that I would want to push back hardest against, in the examples that he laid out in his follow-up video.
Yeah. Well, I think we've pretty thoroughly been over that,
Yeah.
and no, this isn't trying to trash it either, right? Like, I think he had some valid points. I'm not like
No, definitely. I mean, like I said, that 69% thing, I was like, whoa, that's huge,
hmm.
right? Like,
But let's move to a race. Before we do that, though, I want to announce that at the end of the episode, I'll be giving away a key to Endless Space 2 for anybody who hangs around to the end. So hang around for that. I probably should have announced it at the top of the episode, but I forgot.
I probably should have put that in the announcement. We would have like
Yeah.
goosed our viewership.
Yeah. Well, I'll have another game next week. So just as kind of like an insight for anybody watching, I have a bunch of Steam keys that are duplicates. So I will be slowly handing them out over the course of probably the next 5 years of this podcast, because it's definitely going to last that long. But yeah. So before that, how was your week, buddy?
My week was pretty great. I did a zillion mythics. I ended up doing a 10 chest on both Baron and Gondor, who has rapidly become my second most played alt. I thought this was going to be my Assassination Rogue, who I talked a little bit about. Like, the reason I know all this stuff about Assassination Rogue is because my first alt in the expansion was of not warrior. I have two warriors at max level. My first alt of the expansion was going to be this Assassination Rogue, but then I started playing Demonology Warlock, and Demonology Warlock is super dumb, but like in a very fun way. Demonology Warlock is kind of the punch wizard of like specs in the game. if that makes sense. Um, because it doesn't work in a straightforward way, I guess. So for instance, for Baron's cooldowns look like Avatar, plus 20% damage for 20 seconds. Colossus Smash, the target takes 30% more damage for 8 seconds, right? Ravager, it just does a bunch of damage in an AoE, and it gives you 7 rage every time it deals damage, right? Like, very simple, straightforward things, right? The main cooldown for Demonology Warlock is Demonic Tyrant, which has a 1.5 minute like cooldown, and it lasts for 12 seconds. But when it shows up, it extends the duration of all the demons that you have summoned by another 12 seconds, right? So it's like, what the fuck? How much DPS does that give you? And the answer is a fucking boatload. If you if you are summoning demons constantly, you have a million little imps out. You have a million, they're, what are they called? Dreadstalkers, right? It's just like, and then it itself does a bunch of damage, right? It shoots your guy, and then there are like talents for it. There's this one talent that says your demonic tyrant sucks 20% of the health of all of your active demons to empower itself. How much does it empower itself? Who knows? A lot, right? You put it in Sims and it just like farts damage or whatever. And then you start looking at like best in slot for this thing. And it's like, is the best in slot trinket one that you hit it and it gives you a bunch of intellect? Or when you do this thing, it gives you a bunch of haste? Or when 1.5 minute cooldown, you get a bunch of mastery, which increases the damage of all your demons. You would think those would be very good trinkets. No, it's the PvP tank trinket that increases the health of yourself, which also increases the health of your little demons, which also means that the demonic tyrant sucks more health out of your fucking demons. And it's just like, who the fuck figured this out? What the fuck is this? This is the most ridiculous spec in the game. I don't understand, but it's just like so dumb that it's insanely fun. Oh, and the best part of this, and the reason that I was like, oh, this is ridiculous. There's one talent that says it's a 3-minute cooldown. It lasts for 15 seconds, and it says every time you spend a soul shard, summon a demon from the twisting nether to fight alongside you. One demon? Fuck! How much damage does it do? I don't know, but they're demons. And if you summon your demonic tyrant when those demons are out, they get extended for another 12 fucking seconds. So you get into these like just incredibly convoluted situations where I'm like rolling into a boss, and the boss has like a damage phase, right? So in Mists of Tyrannus Scythe, the boss takes 200% extra damage for like 10 seconds when you kill the first boss. He like applies a thing to the second boss, big damage amp, right? And the way that you do that dungeon is you save all your cooldowns for the damage amp. So on Baron, I just that phase starts, I pop Avatar, Colossus Smash, and attack him, right? Very simple. On Gondor, it's like, well, I can't just summon the demonic tyrant. That's not what that doesn't do the damage. What does the damage is all the demons that he's extending the duration of. So 15 seconds before the guy spawns, I do my demonic portal. Then I'm casting a bunch. Then I have to make sure my dreadstalkers are up. Then I have to put out my demonic tyrant. Then the damage ant goes up, and now I'm doing the DPS. And it's just like the level of complexity is like figuring out trade routes in Europa Universalis. It is like this arcane, just indecipherable math that I just find so compelling about it. So I've been playing a lot of Demonology Warlock, and and I ended up doing like the weekly was to do like 4 mythics and you get a chest. And then I just stayed on Gondor and we kept going. The interesting thing about all of this is, even though Gondor's lower eye level than Baron by quite a bit, Gondor's still using his Heart of Azeroth. He's at like eye level like 196 or something like that. Or he was before. He might be higher level now. I was actually putting out pretty comparable numbers to Baron, like about 33% less, but that's still like good DPS. That's like DPS that somebody would take into a plus 10 easily, right? Like when I plug into plus 10s, I tend to be the top DPS doing about 4K, 3.5K DPS. And so if somebody walks in and is doing 2.5K DPS, that's normal. That's pretty like straightforward. And it was funny because just like, I think honestly all that comes from is I have this mastery of the dungeons from Bairn, right? Like because I have run a million fucking mythics on my other character, and I understand these dungeons so well. Um, I'm just like able to eke out additional numbers and additional, you know, stuff. I don't know. It's crazy. Demonology Warlock though, it's really fun. I didn't even talk about the AoE spell for Demonology Warlock yeets your boys, because most of what you're doing is you're summoning little imps, and then the imps shoot their fireballs, right? But then you have a move called Implosion that throws all of your imps at a target, and then it explodes in a radius and does a bunch of AoE damage. And what is the math to an imp shooting its firebolt versus being yeeted? I don't fucking know, but I know that if there's a bunch of imps up, it's probably worth it for me to implode them. Anyway, how is your week? How's your life going?
It's been good. It's been good. And, while you were going this, I was thinking like, maybe an episode to do at some point in the future is to like get the VOD from one of our raid attempts because Ray streams them, right? And like
Mhm.
I think it'd be interesting to like go over like we managed to clear heroic Sun King, right? That's what it's the
Yeah.
account's called this week, and like we went through the process of and by we I mean mostly the guild leadership went through the process of figuring out how we would actually get this down. I think that'd be an interesting thing to go over. Although maybe like hearing the increasing levels of despair in Syrian's voice would not be a great thing to do.
I was talking about this with Sarian, just to subtweet my very good friend Sarian. I was talking about this with Sarian the other day, where he was talking about how mad he was, right? That we got down Artificer in Heroic the week before, and then we went into Tuesday and we weren't able to down him. We had to like wait until the next Thursday. And I do understand how that's like intensely frustrating, but for me, that's just like Heroic rating in a nutshell. First of all, we have a lot of people that don't do both nights, so like Thursday people, we had different tank setups, obviously. And so I went into that fully expecting a lot of wipes to feel like this was progression. But there's that feeling of like when you get a boss down, it's down. You have this boss on farm. You'll never have to worry about this boss again. When it's like, no, no, especially when you get it down. I'm pretty sure our first heroic Zymox kill was very dirty, right? Like most of the raid was dead. It was just like a couple of people up, like eking out those last couple of points of DPS, right? Like, you know.
Yeah, no, and I feel like Sun King's gonna be a pain in the ass just because like I couldn't tell you exactly like how we got that down. I couldn't tell like what I do in like most of the fights. Very simple for me to follow, right? Because a lot of it's like stand on the boss and hit them very hard and like do the
Sure.
mechanics, right? Like just like the sheer like you're talking about with this demonology stuff, the complexity of like, well, I need to zip over here and kill this ad, and like did we push the Sun King into like his shade phase fast enough or like slow enough to like get the right set of ads up so that we're not all like like in some of the fights where like we would push him into a shade phase when there were a bunch of those little guys up. I was just like losing my mind trying to clean up these little things, and like
Yeah, and it's funny. I think these encounters are very well designed. The design of that fight, where like if you have those little guys up, are actually the most threatening of the ads. You would think the assassins, right, or like the vanquisher, which is like the tank mob, like those would be the dangerous guys. Like no, 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 no. Those guys you clean up just fine. You just pull them right to the boss. It's the little bitches. Because I remember I had my meters running, and I pulled up details, and I was just like, man, it felt like those guys were just like free casting across the room, and I was like, holy shit, the amount of free damage these guys did to us just because we couldn't get them down before we pushed into shade, and then we made the call to just ignore them. They're tiny little imp bitches. Who cares, right? Like
and
that was
because they're ranged,
really
they
a huge
don't move,
thing.
right? Like you
Yeah.
can't pull them into. Oh, geez, like
Uh,
I mean, it is a super interesting fight too, though, because like it's not like you lose. It doesn't feel like you lose by wiping. It feels like the room fills up with ads and you can't deal with them anymore. It's just like, well, we're all up, but we're not going to be able to recover from this. Just stand in the fire, right? Like that.
yeah.
It definitely feels like the most unique fight in that sense.
Yeah,
Um,
I also feel like there's a lot of that fight that's interesting when it comes to target priorities. I very rarely was listening to the call outs for like, oh, go do this thing. Like the only really one of those I ever really respected was infusers, just because I theoretically think that it is incorrect to have that kind of high priority mentality. I mean, I explained this during the fight. Have that high priority mentality when a lot of our group are melee, and we need to be applying even DPS, right? Because there was one where we basically all came off of Garithos, the big high torturer guy, and he stayed up super long, and I was just like, this is clearly wrong. Like we need to have one person who is just sitting on a Garithos focusing him down. And so for the rest of the encounter, I just hard sat on Garethos the entire time, and I never swapped to any other ad until he was dead, because just like, you got to kill him quickly. And I think in a perfect scenario, we would probably have like more specified, right? Like, you guys are the this group, you guys are the that group. You got to switch, here and there, so that we are managing like the ad's health better. But what do you?
Yeah, yeah. No, and just like little like oh, we need to move to the assassins when they're returning to stone, otherwise they're going to gen health 5 times.
No, I remember you called that out, and I was sitting there DPSing the assassins with you, and I was like, I feel you, buddy. I'm right here with you, man. Because I was just watching it tick out. I was like, I'm not gonna get it done. I'm not gonna. Oh fuck! Like.
I will say though, I feel good about having my high level ring of touch of death in that scenario, because like every minute it's like that's another ad dead, right? That like
Yeah, honestly, that's very true. That is an incredible legendary for that fight. So good on you,
and
man.
only that fight. Like I noticed that all my other parses went up greatly when I switched to the right legendary. I felt very very frustrated that I had to.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, that's hey.
Yeah.
I wonder how it would go on Houndmaster, because Houndmaster has the ads. Technically, you could get some touch of deaths in.
So I've because I've compared the two, right? Because I've done Houndmaster on both of them. The problem is like in the Sun King fight, there are all a lot of like low health minions. So like it's so in order to make touch of death like really worth it, you have to time it. You can't just use it. So you can activate it at 15% or at when it's at lower health than you. And if you activate it at 15%, it does a third of your health, right? So that's like a 2/3 DPS.
Oh, so you literally have to kill it.
Yeah, well, you have to kill it to maximize the utility on it, right?
Interesting.
Yeah. So, in normal fight, like in the Huntsman fight, I can sometimes time them, but it's also a hard thing to time, right? Like if I'm off by 1 GCD, it'll be dead before I get the chance to cast it, and at that point,
you only have 40k health or whatever, right?
Yeah, yeah. And it's like 30, it's like 35 all buffed up, right? Like, there was part of me that was thinking like maybe I should buy stat food at some point just to like pump that number up. But like, it's a legitimately, at least for me, hard thing to time right. It doesn't matter as much in the little guys. One, because like in the Sun King fight, right? Like there's oftentimes where I'm the only person hitting it, and so I've got like heavy control on that. But like if I miss one in the Huntsman Altimore fight, that's like a quarter of the power of my legendary for that fight just gone, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah, I get that for sure.
The haste really actually feels really good. Like that was the thing that I wasn't expecting. Like I popped I popped Zuin, and it's like, and like especially if it's overlapping with like either one of my troll bursts or like the
bloodlust.
The bloodlust. It's just like it's just like flying in terms of like buttons just like get hit. It feels great.
I'm actually kind of interested that you play. It's funny when I'm talking about Demonology Warlock, is it's just like insanely complicated spec for the game. That you play Windwalker Monk, because I think Windwalker Monk, I wouldn't call it simple, but it is more straightforward than the kind of overcomplicated mess that something like Demonology Warlock has.
It feels like a rhythm game to me more than it feels like like, and I enjoy that, right? Like, it's more about because you have to be hitting things on the moment in order to be maximizing your DP. Like I've had times where like I'll be like I've got my weak cores up and I'll be like, oh no, which button do I like? The biggest decision I have to make is whether I'm hitting a chi spender or a chi generator. And usually I'm like pinged on one of those anyway, so it's not like I've got like a huge choice. But like the challenge there is making that choice in the moment, in time, right? So that I'm maximizing my throughput.
Oh, interesting. So it's like hitting a perfect note, right?
Yeah.
You see the note coming up, but you have to hit it on time, or else you don't have any like.
Yeah,
you don't have time to waste.
And I need to make sure that I'm interweaving them, right? So that like it's like I don't want my energy to max out, because if my energy max out, that's energy I won't have to spend later, right? So like it's like there's like a lot of little decisions there. I find that the other big thing that I struggle with when I look at it is like I'll hit buttons too soon on my either my spinning cheat kick or my Fists of Fury. I'll like miss the last tick on it because I'm too eager to hit the button. So it's kind of like again, rhythm action thing. It's like hold the button until it's done before you switch to you switch to the next thing. But
I actually do super feel that. The Arms Warrior is interesting, and I like the rotation a lot because it is about managing that level of rage. So like, it's like you want to hit Mortal Strike on cooldown, then you want to use excess rage on slam, and you also want to keep like rend up on the target or whatever. So it's like a 60 bank rage of things that you're gonna need your like rage for. So a lot of my decision making is watching my swing timer as I'm like, okay, I'm about to get an influx of rage here. Is this going to a Mortal Strike? Am I going to get above this? Am I going to use a slam? Am I going to use an overpower? Because like overpower is a free GCD. It doesn't cost rage, right? But it is weaker than a lot of my other abilities, right? And I would rather, if given the opportunity, right, hit a Mortal Strike or a Rend over an overpower, right? But then sometimes I'm thinking like, boy, I'm pretty thirsty when it comes to rage. So maybe I'll hit overpower here, then use Mortal Strike, see if it resets overpower, and if that happens, I'm actually DPS up because I got an extra proc of overpower. Like those kinds of decisions are happening like all this sort of time, which I think is what makes arms interesting compared to like Fury is like the go 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 spec, right? Fury is just like hit all your buttons, hit them really fast, hit them as hard as you fucking can, and then rampage and does lots of damage. And like there is thought that goes into that because Fury's mastery is about enrage. So if you are enraged, you deal more damage. So enrage is like 40% extra damage, something like that, right? And so you want to use weak spells when you're not enraged and strong spells when you are enraged, obviously. So that you're not using like raging blow is the example of this. You're not using your raging blows when you're not enraged and you're paying attention to that kind of thing. But like that just feels a lot more straightforward to me to play through than um Arms Warrior or like Assassination Rogue or like um God forbid Demonology Warlock. The Demonology Warlock thing is like I really stumbled into this because like Gondor in kind of an RP scenario is a Demonology Warlock, right? Like that's part of his like backstory and character. And so I do in general like matching the character to their sort of like in-game spec, if that makes sense. And I just sort of happened to walk into this spec and be like, no, this is actually super dumb and also very fun.
no, I definitely get that. Um, Otherwise this week, what did I do? I played a little bit more Death Stranding, Uniting America. That game is so indescribable, like in terms of just like how weird it is. It's like I can't believe he named the character Die Hardman, and like it's just like and like it's like it's like, oh yes, or like the character's called Dead Man, who's a different character, right? It's like, ah yes, I used to be. It's the face of Guillermo del Toro with a different voice because he didn't do the voice acting. And it's like, ah yes, I'm a doctor. Actually, I'm not. I'm an ex-coroner, but that's why they call me Dead Man. It's just like, what are you talking about? What is that? And he's like, ah yes, I need to take your it's there's this baby in a jar, and it's like and Norman Reedus doesn't want to throw it in the trash, and it's like Diamond's like, okay, well I'll deal, I'll take care of it, and then he's like at some point he's like explaining like ah yes, her mother's in the Capitol with me. It's like her mother or its mother. It's like, yes, the still mother. She's dead and the baby's alive, but he needs to return to his mother's womb every once in a while. You have to synchronize her womb with this capsule you're holding, and then like you hook into it and you like flash into its eyes and you see Mads Mikkelsen, right? Like it's like BB, don't worry, Daddy loves you. And it's like what the fuck is happening? And another part of this is like like some of it's just like intentionally obtuse, right? Like you flash into its eyes and you see Mads Mikkelsen and like you hear what he's saying, right? But then Norman Reedus' character tells a different character that he can't understand what that character is saying, and I don't know if he's lying to like, to keep it under wraps. But it's not like it's anything difficult. It's like, wait, am I like, is the character unaware? And this is like, like a dramatic irony. That's the right one, right? Dramatic irony where the viewer knows more. It's like, is it supposed to be that type of situation, or like, just like so the I told you last time we talked about this that one of the early missions is you go and burn your mother's body, right? Like
Yep.
in the incinerator. Like she's the president of the United States of America is like another part of this. But like like this is like this is like the like an inverse dramatic irony, right? Because this is a revelation to me, but like apparently Norman Reedus' character, who's Sam, this is his name, knows this, right? But he doesn't like react to it. But then like they get back, he gets back from that mission, and Deadman's like, oh, you have to go clean up and then meet the president. It's like the president's dead. I just burned her body, and Norman Reedus says this, and the Deadman doesn't explain. It's like, go wash up and meet the president. It's like, what the fuck? And then he walks in, and it turns out it's a different character. But it's like a normal person would just explain that, right? Like we
I remember we talked about how Hideo Kojima is like, like a gaming auteur or whatever, like, and somebody, I guess, maybe compared like Death Stranding to the prequels. It's just like, listen, the prequels have plenty of dumb shit in there, but like, but, it is mind-boggling, these things. Even on just a world building level, I can't even like take some of this stuff
yeah, I mean,
seriously.
and I need to play more of it because apparently more of it gets explained, and you get like plenty of codex. But like the comparison isn't to George Lucas. The comparison is to David Lynch. Like,
Oh, wow.
like that's got to be it, right? Like
Yeah.
and you can pick out other I think auteurs in the space, right? Like in the gaming space, I think, right? Like but like it's Hideo Kojima is something special. And I'm looking forward to finishing this game.
Okay, I've
Even though
got
I'm
a
not
piece
even
of great news for you though. Are
what
you ready? Did you know? Mango.
what
Mango, did you know? Total War Warhammer 3 is coming out this
oh
year. Wait, did you watch the trailer?
I did because somebody posted in the chat and was like, "Oh my god, Cathay!" And it's like, there's going to be Cathay in this trailer, and it's literally just like a half second. It's like I'm like watching these like Russians fighting these demons, which is fun. It's like, so when are the the Chinese enemies going to come in? It's like, oh, or like
Yeah, no, that it mirrors the Skaven. If in the Warhammer 2 trailer, the Skaven aren't announced. They're like, not you have lizardmen fighting dark elves fighting high elves. And then at the very end there's like a thing and there's like a rat or whatever. But part of the in-universe thing about the Skaven is nobody believes the Skaven are real in
really,
the
yeah, yeah,
Empire. Which was like honestly a marketing ploy for them. People were always talking about Skaven, and then like the CA person, the creative assembly person, would be like, Skaven aren't real. They're not coming. And which I
it's
get, that's
clever,
funny
yeah,
sort of
yeah.
thing. But the thing that I found incredible at that trailer, and this is like, what a feat these games have made in like cultivating a community or whatever, is he does the thing where he reveals that Cathay is on the map, and then he looks at the camera and is like, like he grins at the camera, and it's like he's talking to me. I'm the person that shit posts about Cathay not being in Total War Warhammer 3. We all thought it wasn't gonna be in there. We were convinced that it was not gonna be in Total War Warhammer 3. Like so many YouTubers put out videos that were just like, no way Cathay is in there. Cathay is just as like a piece of far flung world building. It's not in any of the books. There's no army roster. There's no nothing, right? Um, and there was like the slim hope. Oh, the Vampire Coast didn't have an army roster, but they made them into a DLC. Like, oh, North Coast didn't have an army roster, but they got a DLC. That's not quite true. North Coast half had an army roster. And
Yeah, I mean, in retrospect, like the existence of Three Kingdoms, I think should have been a bigger tell. Like, not that I was paying attention, but like just like as soon as I heard that, I'm like, oh, they're going to use the Three Kingdoms models, and like that's like how you get like somewhere between 30 and 75% of the way there. Right. I think that'll be the interesting thing is like how much of the army list is just like straight lifted out of Three Kingdoms.
I actually don't think it's going to be that, to be honest with you. I think the core thing that made Cathay hit here is the optimizations that they put in. They spent one DLC cycle not putting out a DLC, right? The DLC cycles are like 3 or 4 months kind of thing, right? Where you just expect to have a new lord pack, a new race pack, something like that, new campaign pack, whatever it is. um and they once took one and they said, listen, our next patch is not going to be a race pack. It's not going to be a lord pack. It's not going to be any pack. It's just going to be an optimization bug fix pass. We're going to take a lot of time to like sort through this stuff. And the thing that they figured out there was a way to supercharge the end turn timer, where like the end turns used to take like 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes maybe, where you're just like sitting there and people were complaining about it all the time. Now it takes like 30 seconds, right? Which, sucks in a certain sense, but like
It's better.
it's just so much faster. It's just so much faster now. And the thing that they always cited as the reason they couldn't go huge on the map was turn timers, right? If the map gets big, turn timers get huge. They just balloon out of control, right? And I think when they made that like optimization in Warhammer 2, they were like, "Oh, we can make the world map much bigger in Warhammer 3, and we're gonna add Cathay." Right? That is my tinfoil hat. I have no evidence for this besides just
Mm.
an inner understanding of, I guess, like game design and what they've talked about. But that's what I think was the reason. I think otherwise we would have just gotten like Kislev. We would have gotten because
Yeah,
there's space on the current map for a little bit of the Ogre Kingdoms, a little bit of Dark or Chaos Dwarves, which are also probably coming. Maybe as DLC, maybe as a pre-order bonus. People think that Chaos Dwarves or the Ogre Kingdoms, because they currently fit in the Warhammer 2 map, might have a Norska situation where they get added as the pre-order bonus for
or
Warhammer
they're like an
3.
NPC race initially or something like that. That
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
until they flesh them out. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, also like I think the third explanation for Cathay is the very cynical, right? Appeal to the Chinese market type stuff, right?
Oh yeah, I'm sure that was a selling point,
Yeah,
obviously.
yeah.
But
No,
like,
I think there's probably all three of these in there, right? Like
yeah,
the text there, the models, some of the models are there, and the Chinese market type stuff.
yeah, I also think they got a lot of support out of Games Workshop. You can really tell that Creative Assembly and the success of the Warhammer franchise or the Total War Warhammer franchise has been pretty huge. Creative Assembly, or I'm sorry, the Games Workshop is bringing back Warhammer Fantasy Battle, which changed to Age of Sigmar.
which people
Um,
didn't like, I think.
yeah, like the end times was a huge thing. They basically put an end to the current continuity, and then they released Age of Sigmar, which is just like whole new set of things. They are now saying they're going back and they're making a thing called the Old World, which is essentially set at the exact same time as the Warhammer, like the Total War Warhammer series. And you can tell, like Games Workshop just must look at this game series and been like, these guys are like the driver of our IP right now, and we kind of have to respect them. Same thing true for Vermintide. I think as like the other big Warhammer game that's like huge right now, comparatively.
Oof. I wonder how who on what side looks at Blizzard or Blizzard looks at them as like this could have been us, but you playing, right? Because like that was the whole Warcraft Starcraft thing, right? Like that's
Yeah,
nuts.
no, absolutely. I almost sort of wonder if I was having this conversation with somebody the other day. I think as much as I love obviously like Blizzard or whatever, I think they kind of lost the strategy game zeitgeist by focusing on multiplayer, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
StarCraft 2 has petered out into basically nothing, and the major
The
strategy
I
game
don't know.
players on the market.
I was gonna say I don't know if you saw this, but the OGN arena shut down. Monte Cristo tweeted about it.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, like it's nuts. But anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Can go on.
Yeah, like, and so, there's just I actually kind of get that for StarCraft. I think StarCraft was fun in its earlier iterations, but we kind of optimized the fun out of StarCraft because once it kind of became clear that the thing that made you better at the game was cramming more APM, right? Being able to just force more actions into your gameplay. And that's what created the highest level of like the highest echelon of players. I just think that the whole game bottomed out, right? Because like that's just not a super fun goal to go towards compared to, other sorts of goals that gamers have in games like League of Legends or WoW or any other sorts of PvP kind of titles, right?
Yeah, and I think that a big driver of the success of esports is the kind of like and I don't think it's exactly this, but it's like the dream that one day that could be you, and when it's a physical skill cap, that's that makes it out of reach, right? Like I don't think people watch esports for the same reasons. I mean, maybe this is self selection bias, right? Like I don't watch League as much as nearly as much as I did when I was playing it. Um, but like I still, this is the other thing I did this week is I watched the Super Bowl or the big game, as the euphemism goes. But like I don't like I occasionally would play pickup. I haven't played in years, but like I don't need to do that in order to enjoy the game. But I feel like esports are kind of inscrutable in a lot of ways. You need to be doing something adjacent, right? Like I enjoy watching Guilty Gear fight. Like when I one year I went to Evo, I watched the Guilty Gear finals. And I thought that was super fun. But part of it I think came out of the fact that I at least played Street Fighter and knew what I was knew what I was looking at. Um,
Yeah,
but yeah,
I had a very easy, like at BlizzCon we watched StarCraft, which was a lot of fun. I'm obviously very aware of StarCraft, but like not on a competitive level, right? Like I've played
mm,
StarCraft the single player a million times, but I basically haven't played multiplayer since 2010, right? Um, but I do sort of wonder if like Blizzard or whoever at Activision makes these kinds of decisions would like ever look at it and be like, what if we just made, a campaign sort of like an open-ended 4X strategy game like Civ or like, Stellaris or something like that inside of the Warcraft or StarCraft universe. I think people would go nuts for that, but who knows?
yeah. I think Warcraft has a better chance of that happening because Warcraft Ladder wasn't like I feel like if you tried to bring like StarCraft without the multiplayer, like people would be screaming for blood. Like just because I don't think that like it like I don't think you can have like I think StarCraft is so tied to that. I think Warcraft, I think there's a lot of people who would be happy with a Warcraft like bigger game just because like these are the type of people who liked Warcraft 3 but don't like WoW just because it's like
Yeah.
not their thing. Um,
I almost wonder if they could pull off something like Total War Warcraft in a way where it's like agnostic of time, but you have orcs, trolls, all of these different factions, right, with their own sorts of things, but it is not, you are not playing through the Warcraft timeline. You're just kind of putting all of these groups in a unit together and saying, oh well, maybe you're going to play the orcs with Garrosh in control, or you're going to play the orcs with Sourfang in control, or you're going to play the orcs with Thrall in control. They're all going to have different sorts of, you know whatever, because I think that's a huge part of the success of these strategy games that we're referencing, is like this ability to really particularize your playthrough at launch, right?
yeah, yeah,
In the StarCraft single player games, you are ultimately locked to that narrative, and you can play through that narrative in a couple of different ways, and you can build, like I like the choices that are on the table for, Legacy of the Void, Heart of the Swarm, Wings of Liberty, obviously, but it's just like way less. And playing a game as Wood Elves is just so different than playing a games as Warriors of Chaos or as the Empire or as Dwarves or whatever else, right? And I sort of wonder if that would be like something that they could kind of like capitalize on or figure out in
yeah,
some way.
yeah. I think a big part of this too is that just kind of like that style of RTS just kind of died, right? Like
Yeah.
like the multiplayer kind of like skirmish based, I guess is what I'd call it. I guess died in favor of MOBAs. Maybe because they're more accessible and you don't have to worry about like it's like all of the RTS stuff, but without like needing to worry too much about like resource generation or that kind of thing. Um,
Hmm.
yeah. But who knows? I just had a brain flash that like it could be cool. Like, have you heard of like Savage and Savage 2? These is like the Han precursors, Here's New Earth precursors.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, so the big conceit of that game, those games, is that like you had a bunch of players playing like basically an action RPG on the ground, but then one player was the commander and he was basically playing an RTS. It'd be neat to see something like that in WoW, where like one player is like playing an RTS and then like and he's got like control of like minions and he can set objectives, but like the big powerful hero units are actual like WoW players. I think it'd be something neat, but um, I don't know. I don't know if that's like a realistic thing to see happen, but I'm sure somebody at Blizzard has thought of that because like that seems like an obvious thing, right? Like
Yeah, it seems like we're getting more and more of that kind of thing too. I feel like it would be really neat to sort of have like a game master. You could do this with dungeons maybe or something like that. Maybe you could do it with Torghast, right? You could have like a player who is like in control of the Torghast wings and can set up the things, and then the players are playing through it. That might be interesting. Who knows?
yeah, no. So I think that I also think that's interesting, but like the thing I'm talking about is like imagine like a PvP map, but like
Oh, okay.
one
Yeah,
player on
sure.
each side is like doing doing the RTS stuff because like the thing that I think is like super kind of like depressing is like they built these like very complex battlegrounds and like a lot of them are just kind of like zerg the objective and do it and then we'll win, right? Like Alterac Valley feels very much like that, and so does what is that the Warlords of Draenor one, uh the Big Island just feels kind of zergy, at least to me. There's all these mechanics that don't get used ever.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, I don't know. The only other thing I did this week was, like I said, watch the Super Bowl. Tom Brady won again. Nerf Tom Brady. I don't know. I'm not. It makes me sad, but it was like not a great game. I assume you didn't watch it.
I did not. I did not at all. I didn't. I was running Mythics the whole time.
Yeah, probably
And
a better use of your
I
time.
understand that Tom Brady, I guess, is like the best football player ever. People are comparing him to Michael Jordan now.
He's got more rings. He's got more. Tom Brady has more rings than any individual football franchise at this point.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Wow. Yeah, because Steelers have 6, right? And he has 7.
yeah. I think another team has 6 as well, but yes,
Yeah.
he has 7. Um,
Yeah, I only
yep.
know the Steelers because my mom is from Pittsburgh.
Uh, but yeah, he has 7. He has 7 rings. It's interesting because I live in New England now, and like he's like he got 6 of them with the Patriots, and
Yeah.
so it's like I've seen 2 sets of reactions. Like 1, he's still our guy, and 2, like he has betrayed us by going to Florida.
It's like CLG and double lift.
Yeah. So the worst part of it, or like the most hilarious part of this, is do you know who Gronk is? Robert Gronkowski.
Mm-mm.
He's a receiver. He played for the Patriots, and then he retired. When Tom Brady went to Tampa Bay, Robert Gronkowski came out of retirement to join the Buccaneers, and he hasn't been around as much as Brady, but like he was in the Super Bowl too. He had a couple of very good plays, right? I will link to you into the chat. There's a great T-Mobile commercial. Like their like kind of like theme is don't leave bad decisions to bad connections, and right, and it's like it's Gronk calling Tom Brady, and it's like you should just retire, right? Like there's nothing wrong with like just relaxing, and no one's gonna call you like weak or anything, right? Just come down, just go to Florida, and maybe I'll join you, right? And then from Tom Brady's side, the way the ad goes is like, don't retire. You are weak. Join go to Florida. I'll join you, right?
That's pretty funny.
But yeah, I still dislike Tom Brady, but have to respect him. Have to respect his ability.
Yeah, because he cheated, right? I tweeted about this.
Okay, so
he fucking cheated, right? That was the thing that happened.
The deflate gate thing is like super controversial. Like it's still unsure whether or not it was like so. My recollection of this, and any hardcore football fans in the chat, feel free to correct me. But my recollection of this is, if something happened, it wasn't at his direction, right? Like he didn't deflate the ball. It would be somebody in the Patriots organization who would have done that.
Oh,
right?
he just knew about it and didn't.
Or
say
maybe
anything, I guess?
maybe he didn't even know, right? Like because like part of this is that like it wasn't like super deflated, right? It's not like it was like a like a flabby thing, right? Like there was some discussion that like maybe this was just kind of like it was inflated inside and then went outside, it was cold, and that caused the air inside the ball to contract, and maybe that caused it, right? Like but my understand, like how much it's tied to him is unknown. I would believe that like this was like Bill Belichick's doing, because I think Bill Belichick is actually kind of dirty, right? Like he's the one that got caught, like like some of the things that he has done is like taped other people, like other teams, and like watch, like like it's like a no to like tape other people's practice and watch it or something like that. And that's the thing that happened, and that's like a Patriots org level thing. That's not a a Tom Brady individually level thing.
Yeah,
I still think Tom Brady's kind of a dick. Like when we were in college, this is the year the Giants beat the second time the Giants beat them in the Super Bowl. I think it was the second. I think this is when this happened. But like he's playing a playoff game, and this is when Tim Tebow's like rising from the like doing his like one run of a season that goes really well. And the Patriots just smash his team in the playoffs. But what, like on a third down, like Tom Brady punts the football himself, and it's like that's just like such a dick fucking move, right?
Oh,
yeah.
That is a huge dick move.
Yeah. So like that's my kind of like there's like back when we were in high school and college, like the Giants were much better, so like that's like part of it. But like that really cemented for me that Tom Brady's kind of an asshole, right? So
wow. Okay. Well, we're definitely at time.
Oh
so
yeah, we're way over
yeah.
time. If anybody is left in the chat who would like a copy of Endless Space, I think there's a roll function. If there's not, just say here and I'll roll it on like random.org. Let me test this. This does not count.
What if you just dropped the code in chat?
I could do that. Okay,
/roll
is not a thing. I could do that. I could do that. And I'm
Better pay attention. If you have this window muted, get wrecked, I
yeah.
guess.
I'm gonna copy
If
the
you're
code.
listening to this after the fact, watch the live streams, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. So for the people who are watching, this is going to be posted from Eternal Tango because I'm watching the stream with my personal account. But here comes the code, and it's in the chat. Don't take it, buddy.
That I took it. No, I'm kidding. I already own an endless space too. So you lucked out this time. Next time though. I actually should play Endless Space. That is another like pillar of like strategy games that I never went back to. I played Endless Space 1 a bit. I played like most of one campaign. I thought it was fine. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
I guess that is it for us this week.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Do you if you'd like to tell us anything you thought about any of the things we talked about on this podcast, like the Super Bowl or PF2E combat, you can reach us at subdersplaygames@gmail.com or podcast@subdersplaygames.com. You can watch this live on twitch.tv/subdersplaygames, where I have started giving out keys. Rate and review us on podcast services, all the other good stuff. But you have anything you're looking to promote?
I will be streaming this week. Buddy Gets Good is returning this Friday. I'm playing a game that I don't know that I'm allowed to announce actually.
Ooh.
But it's cool. We're playing a game and it's gonna be fun. Obviously, Buddy Gets Good is a good time. So that's it. That's what I want to promote.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to say until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.